The early 20th century was the high age of the railways. 70 years of tweaks had made rail travel cheaper, more comfortable and more available than ever before. Canal and long-range coach traffic, which had once dominated transport, were now a fraction of what they had once been. And though aeroplanes and cars were beginning to make an appearance, they were for the large part toys for the super rich. The overwhelming majority of transport was handled by trains. The railways at the start of the 20th century moved as much freight traffic as they did passengers, with almost every industry in some way depending on the railways for supply and distribution. Goods-only branch lines fanned out from the main lines, carrying goods all the way from the producers to the factories, the markets and the docks. And there was barely a town in the country that wasn't connected to the network in some way, shape or form. And still the network was growing, pushing into areas the railway revolution had previously passed by. The Western Highlands were one example. The low population and rough ground made them unattractive to railway companies, which had caused the fishing villages along the coast to stagnate. In the 1890s, the government put forward funding to fix the issue, which was now finally seeing fruit. Extensive use of concrete made building in the soft Highland soil much easier, and a number of towns were finally connected in this era, allowing the locals to finally take advantage of the railways for selling their goods. Some of these lines could be very picturesque. Where the Mallaig Extension Railway passed over Glenfinnan, the Glenfinnan Viaduct was constructed, largely out of concrete. 381 metres long, 30 high, and with 21 arches, one of the last rail bridges to capture the imagination of the British public. The Edwardian era was also the peak time for tramway building in the country. Trams were getting bigger and more reliable all the time, thanks to the miracle of electricity. Between 1900 and 1914, more than 160 networks were built or upgraded across the country. And at the start of the First World War, around 4,000 kilometres of track was in operation in more than 200 networks in various towns and cities across the British Isles, almost 10 times the number that exists today. In London, 2 huge networks were built up on either side of the Thames. London Council wished to link the two up, but they were repeatedly blocked by residents of the inner city, who believed that the cables would spoil the historic streets and the trams would draw poor people to the area. But the construction of Kingsway in 1905 allowed a tram route to be built into the plan, topped off with Britain's only purpose-built tram tunnel, dipping under the Strand and emerging beneath Waterloo Bridge, where the route ran down the embankment and crossed the river at Westminster and Blackfriars Bridges. With the two halves now connected, London could boast the biggest tram network in Europe. Electric railways were growing in general. In 1903, the Mersey Railway, which ran through a tunnel between Liverpool and Birkenhead, became the first steam line to be converted to run on electricity. In 1905, the Metropolitan and District Railways followed suit, electrifying the inner circle in its entirety. Not only was this more comfortable for passengers, but with no need to worry about overpressuring the engines, the trains could run much faster, covering the inner circle in 50 minutes, whereas the steam engines could only manage 70. Nonetheless, the steam engines would continue running on overground sections until 1970. In fact, one of the original engines was never officially withdrawn, and is still run along the lines on special occasions. In 1908, most of the various subterranean railways in London were amalgamated into a single network, known as the London Electric Railway, later renamed the London Underground. Mainline electric services were also on the grow. In the Edwardian era, the length of electric lines built or electrified was comparable to new steam lines. Electric trains were not nearly as fast or as powerful as their steam counterparts, but they were much cheaper to run on a small scale, particularly on lines with light passenger numbers which would only require 1 or 2 carriages. For lines like this, an entire steam engine would have been excessive. But in some regions, companies wished to run similar railcars but could not scrape together the funding to electrify their lines. On one line in Teesside, the North Eton Railway turned to a new idea known as the internal combustion engine. An internal combustion engine operates through a series of cylinders driving a shaft, which go through 4 phases, known as intake, compression, power and exhaust, colloquially referred to as suck, squeeze, bang, blow. In the first phase, the cylinder travels down. A camshaft opens up an intake valve, drawing air into the system. The valve is then closed, and the cylinder travels up, compressing the air and making it very hot and volatile. Fuel is then injected in. In a petrol engine, it is ignited with a spark from a spark plug. In a diesel engine, the air compression alone is enough to ignite it. In either case, the fuel rapidly combusts and expands, driving the cylinder down. Cylinders are typically arranged so that at least one will be in the power phase at any given time, driving the others along. Finally, the exhaust valve is opened and the cylinder travels up. Exhaust gas is ejected from the system. The petrol-powered internal combustion engine was invented by Nicolas Otto in 1876. In 1897, Rudolf Diesel built the first diesel engine. Early experiments applying these engines to trains tended to use diesel or petrol traction, in which the engine drives the wheels directly. A system which would in time prove useful for heavy freight services, but which had a very low power-to-weight ratio when pulling the lighter passenger trains. The North Eastern Railway's new railcars were different. They used a smaller petrol engine to turn a generator, powering electric motors, the world's first petrol-electric trains. This system allowed a much better power-to-weight ratio than any petrol traction system would have allowed. The North Eastern Railway built 2 petrol-electric autocars, and they were successful in their job, staying in operation until 1931. A handful of similar machines were built in the country, but these were isolated cases. Internal combustion was still something of an experimental concept, and coal was much more readily available in the country than oil. The high days of the diesel train were still to come. While new motor powers were being experimented on, steam trains were getting faster, more powerful and more efficient all the time. In 1904, the Great Western Railway introduced Britain's first long-distance non-stopping service between London and Penzance. After holding a competition to name the service, it was dubbed the Cornish Riviera Express. Like many companies on their most famous routes, Great Western would schedule in speed runs for the excitement of important guests. In 1904, one particular run on a train known as City of Truro was attended by well-known rail journalist Charles Rouse Martin. He took timings during the run and claimed to have measured a gap of 8.8 seconds between 2 quarter-mile posts. A postal worker, who had been tasked with measuring the train's progress, made the same measurement. This gives City of Truro a strong claim to have been the first steam train to surpass 100 miles an hour in transport, or 161 kilometres an hour. This was at a time when no car or aeroplane had achieved such speeds. Due to the lack of official recording equipment, the record can never be verified, nor did City of Truro ever repeat it. But Great Western chose to treat it as true, and City of Truro became their poster child. City of Truro managed its feat even without a new revolution in steam power which came a few years later, and that revolution was superheating. The steam which comes out of a kettle is not so much a gas as a vapour, with lots of little water droplets suspended within. To convert it to superheated or dry steam, it must either be pressurised beyond anything practical for motive power, or further heat energy must be applied to the vapour. But in traditional boilers, the fluid was being boiled and then just sent on its way. German engineer Wilhelm Schmidt was the first to apply proper thermodynamic principles to design, rather than just using trial and error. He correctly calculated several advantages to dry steam, and so designed a system where the steam, instead of being fed straight to the cylinders, would first be run through several narrow pipes running through the flues. This allowed the steam to be heated up into the superheated region as it travelled. The advantages of this system soon manifested themselves. In an idealised steam cycle, the entropy of the fluid will remain constant as it travels through the cylinders. The useful work energy produced by the fluid in this stage is equal to the drop in heat energy, or enthalpy. And the drop in heat energy along a line of constant entropy is much sharper in the superheated region, so the energy output of the engine could be greatly boosted. In trains with multi-stage expansion, the steam could be fed through a second stage of superheating in between the cylinders, reheating it and allowing the work output to further increase. Of course, a cycle is never idealised. Entropy always increases as energy is lost to things like noise, friction and waste heat. But dry steam could help further there. The wet vapour will condense and collect around the edges of pipes and cylinders, creating friction and losing heat energy in the process. The dry steam meant that there were no water droplets to worry about, significantly increasing the efficiency of the cylinders. The efficiency of the boiler was increased too, since much of the heat energy, which would otherwise have been vented into the atmosphere, was instead put to use heating up the superheaters. Schmidt built his first superheated steam train in 1898. In 1906, Great Western introduced the first such trains to Britain. The greater thermal efficiency meant that steam trains could run faster and longer with a minimal increase in fuel, and with passenger numbers at an all-time high, profits for the companies soared, but not everybody benefited from this. The late 19th century had seen a string of boom and bust cycles, with the cost of living increasing during the bust phases, but staying the same during boom phases. At the same time, there was no nationwide standard of wages. So though Britain was prospering, the working classes in many areas were badly underpaid by their employers and struggling to make ends meet. The early 1910s were a time of great unrest, with mass movements in many industries calling for stronger pay and better working conditions, allied with groups calling for political reforms. Throughout this, there were many acts of violence and sabotage on both sides. The railways were no exception. The unions had been peacefully campaigning for fairer pay and better working conditions since their formation in the 1870s. But whilst conditions had improved, progress was painfully slow. The government had a lot of wealthy backers in the rail companies, and thus a lot of incentive to block any serious attempts to bring in national policies on worker rights. With no regulation, these things were left up to the generosity of the employer, and many of the workers lacked a means to relocate. Not only were they underpaid, they were also regularly working exhausting 12-hour shifts, with the company regularly forcing them to work longer at short notice. One newspaper article reported the story of a brakeman who'd been kept on duty for 43 hours without a break. When it was seen that he was nodding off, porters were sent to prod him awake on a regular basis. In 1907, the government set up the Consolation Board as a body wherein the workers could report their grievances. But the workers soon came to see the board as an empty gesture, where their issues could be unofficially ignored. In 1911, workers in Liverpool decided they'd had enough and went on strike. The sentiment soon spread to surrounding companies and cities where the workers were in similar situations. In August, the railway's four main unions met in Liverpool to combine their efforts: the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants, the Associated Society of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen, the General Railway Workers' Union, and the United Pointsmen and Signalmen Society. They believed nationwide action was needed to make the government listen. The Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, met with the rail bosses to assure them that the lines would keep running. He then met with the union leaders separately and offered to set up a royal commission to examine the workings of the 1907 Consolation Board. The unions feared another empty gesture and rejected his offer, declaring the first nationwide rail strike. Calling it a nationwide strike may be a bit of a misnomer. It was up to the individual whether they walked out or not, and only a third of Britain's rail workers chose to do so. Some of the more generous employers had earned a certain level of loyalty from their workers. In the London and South Western Railway, for instance, only 2 of their workers walked out. The more affluent areas in the south of England may have seen little strike action, but it was an altogether different story in the north of England and in Wales. Here, mass strike action brought the country to a grinding halt. Many workers even worked to sabotage lines that were still running during the strike. The Home Secretary, Winston Churchill, took the controversial decision to deploy 58,000 troops against the strikers, with the express purpose of keeping the railways running. This had the effect of inflaming tensions further, and violent clashes broke out, in which several of the strikers were shot dead. But shooting them only swung public opinion further in favour of the strikes. In many regions, the protests blossomed into full-on riots, which would continue for days after the strike was officially over. After 2 days of strikes, Asquith was able to get union leaders and company bosses round the same table to hash out a deal. In many ways, it was the same deal he had offered the unions already: a royal commission to examine the workings of the 1907 Consolation Board. But now that the unions had established their power and sway, they felt confident the commission would be taken seriously and not treated as an empty gesture. They also felt they could confidently negotiate from a position of strength. By the end of the year, pressure from the unions had already driven Parliament to pass laws legally requiring brake levers to be placed on both sides of goods trucks, so that shunters would no longer have to climb between them to apply the brakes, something they had been campaigning for since the 1870s. In 1913, the unions were merged into the much more powerful National Union of Railwaymen. How events would have played out from here can never be known, as the disputes were soon overshadowed by much bigger events. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated by a Serbian gang. Through a chain of alliances and ultimatums, every major power in Europe, and soon the world, was plunged into war, and Britain's railways would have a key role to play in the conflict. But that is a subject for next time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you've not already done so, and leave a comment, it helps the channel grow. And why not check out my website for more examples of my work? I am currently working on the next part of this series, and it should be with you in the next couple of months. Bye for now.